If you'll join me, we'll open in prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to identify the social basis for the flourishing of democracy in the mid-19th century. You should be able to describe the efforts made in this period to strengthen the economic integration of the nation and to identify the major crises that hindered the efforts to strengthen the integration. You should be able to identify the major areas of conflict between nationalism, which is thinking of the country as a whole, and sectionalism, which is thinking of the country in its parts. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. And I'm going to be honest, Roman numeral number 10, I meant to delete from your notes, but I didn't. It's a little non sequitur to the timeline, so we'll do it, but let's not get distracted by it, okay? Rhode Island in 1841 had property qualifications for voting. If you wanted to vote in Rhode Island, you needed to own land in it. But landless workers, in particular factory workers, thought that was unfair. They thought that they were subjects of a system they couldn't participate in. So they gathered together in what became known as the People's Convention and wrote a new state constitution. Worth noting that this did not have legal standing. This would be like a pep assembly getting together and deciding to write a new constitution for the state of Kansas. Like, that might be a fun thing to do, but it doesn't have any legal credibility if we elect Mr. Supala, the new governor of the state of Kansas. Like, it's not going to work, right? So, but there was for a time a claim that there was a second revolution in the state of Rhode Island that established Thomas Dorr, this guy in the bottom left corner with the excellent hairline, as the new governor. There was for a time like 2 rival governments at the same time, one of which had recognition and one of which was not recognized. President Tyler, whom we haven't met yet, we'll meet him next class, sent in federal troops. The Dorr movement collapsed, and Thomas Dorr of the excellent hairline spent a couple years in jail waiting out his time. Subpoint B. Here's where our plot really begins, with a Frenchman named Alcide de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a Frenchman, and he lived in all of the turmoil of the French Revolution. He watched a monarchy turned into beheading the monarch, turned into like the republic, turned into chaos, turned into like Napoleonic style chaos, to where Napoleon was overthrown and they restore the King of France and the Bourbon Restoration. You had a hand up, Christian, yes?
Yeah,
you may. So they restore the King of France, where then France decides that was a mistake, and they overthrow the king into the Second Republic. That doesn't work out well. Napoleon III, so grandson, establishes the Second Empire, which overthrows into the Third Republic. And Tocqueville is living through this and thinking like, this is kind of chaos. This is only in a few years of time that France just gets overthrown and overthrown again. And they look across the Atlantic and they see what's going on in America and they say, the United States, I'm not sure, has their total act together, but at least they're not having bloody revolutions every couple of years. What's going on here? So Alcide de Tocqueville, he comes to the United States and begins a research, initially based on prisons, but eventually more about like what it means to be an American and how do you do the process here. So in 1831, French diplomat and historian Alcide de Tocqueville toured the United States and studied American democracy. Today we would call him a political scientist, but that term didn't exist then. Tocqueville was particularly impressed with America's commitment to equality. However, he also worried that maybe Americans in our radical equality overvalued individualism. Didn't have a sense of like community as much as like individuals. So Tocqueville, what he writes is that because the United States has high levels of equality and high levels of individualism, means that there is no mediating class. He calls that a middle class. We use that term about economics now, but he's talking about governing. He says there's no middle class between the government and the people. There's no like aristocratic middle, something to buffer you from the power and the people. He says that gets people, ordinary citizens, too much control over their government. And he says what you end up going to have is mobs in the streets. Tocqueville said that America gives too much power to ordinary Americans. Now, Tocqueville is probably coloring his lens this through watching the mobs in the streets in France, where there was a little too much power in the streets. The ability for people to make bad decisions in large groups, right? That's tough. So Tocqueville was worried about that. He was worried that democracy could be just a tyranny of the majority. Worth noting, the founders also shared this fear, and the Constitution appears to anticipate it. Little things like the Electoral College, that you don't actually vote for the president, that you vote for somebody who votes for the president, you choose an intermediary, tries to mitigate the amount of like the mob mentality of ruling a country. Until the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. What was the 17th Amendment to the Constitution?
Direct election of senators.
Direct election of senators, right? Before that amendment, we didn't get to vote on our United States senators. We voted for our Topeka legislature, and then they picked our senators for us. So the 17th Amendment would change that to try to put the hands further into the people. But the founders appear, the more I study the Constitution, the more I'm really impressed by it. It's like, gives power to the people, yet limits that power. It gives power to the central government, yet limits that power. It's like walking this line, and I think it's done brilliantly. Tocqueville was particularly impressed by much of what he saw in American life, in particular admiring the stability of the economy and the popularity of its churches. He also noted the irony that America is professing to love freedom, yet mistreating Native Americans and keeping people enslaved. Subpoint C. By 1840, more than 90% of adult white men were eligible to vote. And we begin to think of like, what does it mean to be an American? Americans don't have an ethnicity. We don't have a bloodline that it's an American bloodline. Even Americans today say like, well, I'm Irish, even though they've never been to Ireland in their whole life, right? Like we begin to like claim our bloodlines with it. But if Americans don't do that, we take our American identity out of a sense of our political institutions. You'll sometimes hear that America is a whole nation. We're a nation that believes something together. We believe in the democracy together. We believe in the system together. We're a system of beliefs rather than dirt, rather than a slice of the world. Subpoint D. We also got to talk about some developing understandings of information, and this also kind of affects because we are a country of the institutions, because we are a nation of the process. How does the process get forwarded? The market revolution and the growing political democracy produced an expansion in the public sphere. More people could just take part in the discussions of the day. And in particular, there was an explosion in printing. There was this big move towards a printing press. With the further use of the steam engine, steam engines were attached to newspaper printers to produce goods faster, which drives down the cost of printing, which makes newspapers cheaper, which makes information cheaper. Just knowing stuff becomes more accessible. And we refer to it as the time of the penny press. The penny press newspapers were cheap, tabloid-style newspapers, mass-produced in the United States, starting at about the 1830s, and would keep going kind of until newspapers begin to get irrelevant by the 60s. Well, they're irrelevant now. They weren't irrelevant. They lose their gusto with TV. But mass-produced, inexpensive newspapers became possible because of mass production. Now, the penny press was not necessarily high journalism. They might have sensationalism or crime stories, which aren't really news. When you hear about a shooting in the streets, it's not actually news. It's a police blotter. It's more of an event than news. But still, people like to read about it, so it gets printed. Reduction in printing costs also made it possible for alternative sources of news and alternative audiences to be embraced. African Americans, early days of the labor movement, slavery, slave abolitionists can also disseminate information because printing's just cheaper and more accessible. Roman numeral number 11. You'll remember that the War of 1812, while we get to claim credit for winning it because we won the last battle, in reality it's more of a draw. More like the English just sort of gave up. Wasn't that big of a deal for them. But what the great thing about the War of 1812 was that we didn't collapse into anarchy. We didn't turn into tyranny. And there's this burst of national pride that we can do it. Yes, Jackson?
What's going on with the baby?
The punch in the face.
That's a lot of
It's a lot. Well, head wounds bleed a lot. You know what? This is just a good life lesson. Head wounds bleed a lot. You should know that in life. When somebody has a head wound, they're going to get pretty bloody. They may not be dying. So don't freak out if somebody gets a head wound and bleeds a lot. This is just a little free advice on a Wednesday here. No, I'm just saying don't panic about it. Don't panic about it. They call this the boxing match, or another bloody nose for John Bull. John Bull it's actually still, sometimes you'll see, it's the way that Great Britain personifies itself. Like we have Uncle Sam or Lady Liberty. When you wanted to make a person that stood for a whole country, John Bull is that he will look different over the years, but they keep calling him John Bull. That's like classic England is John Bull. Yeah.
Did we make that up, or did
That's an English thing. No, that's an English thing. Yeah. The English think of themselves as a bulldog, like tough, stout, not flashy, growly. The English kind of think of themselves as bulldog people. Okay, let's get back on topic. There was a new manufacturing system that came out of the War of 1812, a new emphasis on manufacturing. We talked about this last class. It also coincides with new technologies and steam engines and steamboats. The War of 1812 kind of fuels all of that together. And it pushes manufacturing sector at the same time that our agricultural sector is feeling pretty good, particularly because Europe has just been fighting Napoleonic Wars. Their economy is wrecked. Their fields were torched and run over. And we have a pretty good gig selling stuff to Europeans. And all of this looks like it's coming up American. And in 1815, James Madison put forth a new blueprint for economic development, which just becomes referred to as, and I don't really like this name, but this is what they call it, the American system. Okay, the American system to us moderns kind of means nothing. That just sounds like a generic name. But in 1815, this sounded like, hey, this is the way the United States does business. This is the way we're going to become the strongest, most important country in the world. They're not yet. In 1815, we are not a strong and important country. We're kind of small potatoes. But it's going to happen because of the American system. And it's kind of promulgated by a congressman named Henry Clay. And it has three basic parts to it. First, there'd be a strong banking system. We did not have a strong banking system since Jefferson tried to dismantle the old Hamilton Bank of the U.S., right? By the time the War of 1812 comes around, what is left of the national bank, it's it's not even politically popular to borrow from it. The bank lapses. And that's actually one of the problems that Madison had during the War of 1812 was financing it. He had to go to just local banks and borrow money because there wasn't an easy way to do it. So Henry Clay's American system, strong banking system, have a Bank of the United States. Second, to have a protective tariff to protect American manufacturing. Basically, we have a new emerging manufacturing sector. We should put a tariff on imported goods to make it more possible for that sector to thrive. And then lastly, to build infrastructure. The word infrastructure didn't exist in the early 1800s, so they refer to them as another like term that means kind of nothing to us now, but they called them the internal improvements. Roads, canals, build the network that you can move goods on. So the roads and canals, the internal improvements, and that would actually be funded by the Tariff of 1816. So this is the American system, and James Madison gets handed this idea of the American system. Yeah?
Don't tariffs just like not work though, because they just put them back on us?
So there's always the risk of a reciprocal tariff. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes that seems more pressing than others. Yeah?
Did they build dams out of wood then?
They build darns, please. This is a Catholic school. Okay. I think they make them out of earth. Like, darning. What is wrong with you?
But does the darning mean to fix a sock? What?
I'm not going to keep having this conversation if you can't use proper language. Yes. To darn up a river? We will also accept dang it. Yeah, like the Hoover dang it. Like that's maybe America's greatest dang it. Okay, yes.
When did dang it become a thing? Like in general in history?
The ancient Egyptians? Maybe more than that?
If I thought about that, then I would have asked that question.
Okay, so hey, welcome back. Welcome back. So Henry Clay, oh, by the way, Madison proposes this idea, and the irony is that none of this American system is actually a brand new idea. It's all cribbed off of the old Hamilton approach to the government. You need a strong central government, use taxes in your favor, and fund with federal dollars improvements of the country. That Madison, one time Hamilton's buddy and later his rival, now Madison is just kind of like riding the tide after Hamilton is gone. But worth noting that after a while, Madison began to second guess the roads and canals thing, began to thinking that like maybe this isn't something the federal government should be doing. Maybe it threatens individual power if the federal government starts building roads that used to be done by companies and states. So after a while, Madison kind of flips on that third part and begins to veto internal improvements.
He kind of does that a lot with his ideas.
You know, Madison, I don't have a good mental image of Madison. I don't know the person very well, but it appears to me that Madison believes things, but that he's also open to evaluating the situation. That like he's not gonna, right, if your coach has an idea of the way they want to play the game, but you get into the game and it seems like the approach isn't working, you need to be flexible. Like you stick with the plan, but if the plan doesn't work, you got to change. I think that's kind of Madison. Like he has the way he wants it to go, but he's also not a stalwart on his system. Yes.
So I mean, like,
Are we back to the dang it's thing?
is
Okay.
it kind of like this? So like if you're a fly fisherman and you hate people who use bait and flies that look like
Excuse me, real quick. What is going on over here? Do I need to review the tape and see this? Because literally, it's on tape.
I'm throwing the challenge flag. I'm throwing the challenge flag.
Yeah, he's not gonna.
Okay. I don't want this to happen again. Okay? Thank you. Subpoint B. Henry Clay of Kentucky, this guy on the right, Henry Clay of Kentucky, led a faction of the Republicans. So the Federalist Party has collapsed. There's really only one political party left, but it's worth noting that it's not a very well united party. And on one side of them are kind of the National Republicans. The National Republicans think of our country as a single nation. They're probably the successor of the Federalists, but the Federalist Party isn't like active politically anymore. But Henry Clay is kind of that wing, is the nationalist side. And in 1816, he sponsored a bill to create a second Bank of the United States, which is just simply known as the BUS, the Bank of the United States, and persuaded Madison to sign that bill and to rebuild central banking in the United States. The second bank was a little bit of a different model than the old Hamiltonian bank. This is a profit-making company whose sole goal is to serve the government. The Bank of the United States had branches in several states, so it has branches in a variety of places around the country, which tries to decentralize its power because it's operating in several places at the same time. Now, local banks, there are still banks that are chartered by their states. Local banks are still operating, and they kind of look at the Bank of the United States as maybe a rival, but certainly a complication, and here's why. This might come as a surprise, or at least kind of a confusion to you. Currency, like dollar bills, currency used to be printed by local banks, and every bank would have kind of its own currency. And they were more like coupons to draw on cash in the bank. So if you had, $100 worth of gold in the bank, you would get a certain amount of receipts, and then that becomes your currency that can be traded. So if Jackson gives me $100, thank you, and I would give him maybe 10 receipts worth about $10 a piece. And then he would have that because I have received the money. He gets the receipt from it. And it turns out that, Zach wants to borrow some money from me. He wants to borrow $20 from him. But he doesn't actually have the $20. He's put it in my bank. He's put it in Wellbarica State Bank, right? But he does have the receipts for it. And he could say, well, Zach, let me give you these two $10 receipts. And you could go to Wellbarica State Bank and they'll just give you the money for it, right? So like currency develops from a local banking. Now this isn't where paper money originates, but it's the way it starts to operate in this time. So local banks would print their own money, and the value of that money would fluctuate wildly. Because perhaps I have $100 in the bank, but Bethy wants to borrow $50 so she can open a business, some $50 business. I'm not sure what that would be. She's buying silly bands to go sell on street corners, and she wants to borrow $50 so she can go buy silly bands. And so she comes to the Bank of Wellbarica and Wellbarica State Bank, and she borrows some of Jackson's money, and I loan it out to her. But Jackson has actually put the $100 in the bank. He's walking around with the $100 in receipts. But I'll also, because I have that money in the bank, we'll write a couple of receipts to Bethy, and then this is how banks create money, and this is, go take econ class, you'll love it. I see you, Harry. I'm not calling on you yet. So local banks printed money, the value of the paper money fluctuated wildly, and the Bank of the United States was supposed to prevent the overissuance of money. That I have issued receipts to both Jackson and to Bethy, and furthermore, that when Bethy starts to pay me back, I would demand from her that she pay me back not in receipts from some other bank, like if she's gone and put, the profits of her silly bands business are being deposited, not in the Bank of Wellbarica, but, I don't know, Bank of Hedwigistan, our rival country, rival state, Hedwigistan. I don't know if I would accept Hedwigistani money. And so, I demand that Bethy's going to repay me in actual gold. Okay, Harry, you had a hand up.
Yes, this might be kind of like a hard question to answer, but why is gold and silver and stuff like that valuable?
That is a magnificent question. I'm going to give you a short, dodging answer and encourage you to go take econ class next year so you can get to a better, lengthier, more substantial answer. And that is that gold and silver, all precious metals, are precious because we agree they're precious. Now, gold is pretty important. It has a lot of uses. It's actually a pretty awesome metal, but its value is only what somebody will pay you for it.
So if, like, tomorrow, all of a sudden everyone just, like, realized that they hated gold.
I don't think that would happen.
But,
It's
like, theoretically.
uh,
Like, if everyone
perhaps.
was focused-
Gold is historically a pretty stable thing because it's just such a useful metal. It's more than just shiny. It's actually pretty useful. But yeah, it is shiny. It doesn't tarnish. One of the interesting things about gold. But yeah, for a lengthier question or lengthier answer, you should enroll in econ class. Okay. So where are we at here? The bus was supposed to prevent the overissuance of money because it could demand payment in gold and silver from local banks. Now, people didn't like the Bank of the United States for a variety of reasons, including, and this is important, a belief that it just wasn't the kind of thing a federal government should do. We expect our federal government to keep us from, like the Canadians invading our country. We have a central government to regulate trade, to elect a president and a leadership, but do we really expect our central government to be printing currency and, negotiating trade between people? So there's this feeling that maybe this isn't the right business for the federal government to be in. This is a little foreign to us moderns because we kind of think the federal government can do anything. We almost anticipate no limits on a federal government anymore. But at the time, people were like, I don't know, maybe this is something at best states should be handling. Okay, Richard, and then we're going to move on. Yes. So people oppose the bus for various reasons. Now here's where it gets sticky, and I want you to pay attention to these details. The state of Maryland didn't like the Bank of the United States, the second bank of the U.S. The state of Maryland decided to try to push the national bank, if they can, out of existence, but certainly out of Maryland. And so the Maryland legislature adopted a tax on all banks operating in Maryland, but not chartered by Maryland. So even like a commercial bank, if it was chartered in Virginia, if Commerce Bank was chartered in Virginia but had a branch in Maryland, then they would need to pay a tax on that Maryland branch. In one sense, this is just kind of an ordinary tax, and states do this kind of stuff all the time. But in particular, as it related to the Second Bank of the United States, this meant that the state of Maryland would then be taxing a federal institution. And the Maryland legislature walks into the branch of the bus, and they go up to a guy named James McCulloch. James McCulloch is a cashier. He's like a vice president for the bank. Today we'd call him a vice president. Mucky muck in the bank. He's a who's who. And go up and they say, Mr. McCulloch, we're going to need you to pay the tax on this bank operating in Maryland but not chartered by Maryland and therefore subject to a tax. And McCulloch says, no, I don't pay state taxes on a federal bank. So it's good to see you, Mr. Maryland, but you can fly a kite. And refuses to pay the tax. I guess we got 2 life lessons today. If you refuse to pay taxes, the police will come after you. Eventually, they're coming, right? So, McCulloch gets dragged into county court and accused of tax evasion for the Bank of the United States operating in the state of Maryland. And McCulloch, perhaps unsurprisingly, loses in court. And he says, but this is a federal institution. Why would we pay a Maryland tax? And they appeal. And they go up to the Maryland Court of Appeals, and perhaps, unsurprisingly, loses in the Maryland Court of Appeals. Now, I'm sure the fine people in the Maryland justice system would not just rule in favor of the state of Maryland whenever they get there. I'm sure that's not true. But I think I could say I was pretty unsurprised that McCulloch would lose that next level. And then it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, McCulloch versus the state of Maryland, and sits before Lil John John Schwarzenegger Marshall, who presides over the second great Supreme Court case in American history, that of McCulloch versus Maryland. Yes?
Are we going to skip this one out too?
No, we're not. No, you're getting the whole dramatization right here. Okay, so they go and they appeal there, and the case gets taken up before the United States Supreme Court in a total Marshallian kind of way. He's like, I got this kind of like tricky case. I'm going to boil it down to what is the root question of this thing. Does the Congress have the ability to establish a bank? That's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the Maryland tax. We're talking about, does the federal government have the authority to charter a bank? Because that's what this whole real argument is about. And John Marshall wrote the opinion of the court. Yes, TJ? You may. And he writes the opinion of the case. And it's actually a unanimous decision. So everybody agrees on this one in the Supreme Court. And he writes, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's Article 1, so what branch of the government are we talking about? I've heard all three here. Somebody say it with authority. What is Article 1? Yes, it's the legislature. The founders believed the most important branch was the legislature. They put it first. Pay attention to this. Congress believed that the legislature was the most important branch, so they put it first. They thought the president was going to be the second most important branch. They put it second. We would probably flip those today. We probably think that the president, like you think that Donald Trump is the whole entirety of the federal government, right? We probably flip those today. But the founders believe the legislature, as the voice of the people, is going to be the most important branch. They put it number one. So if I hear Article 1, Section 8, I'm immediately knowing this is about the powers of Congress. Okay? Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to make all laws, and here's the important term, necessary and proper. All laws necessary and proper. If it's something you need to do to run a government, you can make that law. All laws necessary and proper to carry out Congress's power. Now, Marshall starts referring back to the Federalist Papers in his Supreme Court decisions here. And he goes back to the Hamiltonian idea, like the construction of the Constitution is broad. You can use it in a lot of ways. And Marshall wrote, let the end be legitimate, and let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and by all means appropriate, here's the important part, all means that are appropriate, which are not prohibited, are constitutional. So as long as the Constitution doesn't say you cannot do this, and as long as it's appropriate to good governing, then green light, Bank of the United States. And since the bank, furthermore, since the bank was a lawful instrument of a specific authority, the law creating the bank was constitutional. Yes?
But isn't that like how they justified Japanese internment the same way?
It's hard to say no to that. Furthermore, Article 6 of the Constitution, which I don't expect you to know at this point in your life, but Article 6 of the Constitution says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Anything in the laws of the state to the contrary, notwithstanding. So, the powers of the federal government are the supreme laws, and just because Maryland doesn't like it, doesn't mean that they can override the power of the central government. And here's the best part. So libertarians straighten up a little bit at this John Marshall line, even though Marshall was no libertarian. They love this line. Since the power to tax is the power to destroy, the states have no power, by taxation or otherwise, to control federal laws. Therefore, triangle dots, dot, 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 triangle dots. Therefore, the law imposing a tax on the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and void. Here's why we study McCulloch versus Maryland. It's not really about banking policy. The reason that we study McCulloch versus Maryland is because it is one of the early, strong standouts. Stake your post in the ground. The federal government has authority. The necessary and proper clause is broad and wide. And unless something is improper, it's probably going to be allowed. McCulloch versus Maryland is about a major expansion of federal government power. And it gives a lot of cover to the legislature to kind of, I don't want to say do whatever they want, but gives them a lot of latitude to operate in. Subpoint D. The Bank of the United States then, constitutional and permitted, then begins to allow things that I don't think anybody really likes all that much. With the establishment of a new central banking authority, you see that there's a participation by ordinary people in a speculative fever. So people start borrowing all kinds of money to go buy new land, to build new factories. America in the early 1800s went into debt pretty quickly. Especially because the economy looked pretty sweet after the War of 1812. Europe was wrecked. We had a good customer. We got a central bank that makes all of this happen. And in 1819, the floor falls out as European demand for farm products pretty quickly returned to normal levels, and the economic bubble burst, and all those people that had mortgaged the farm to buy more farm have just lost all their biggest customers. Demand for land fell. Supply and demand means that the prices also fell. And both the Bank of the United States and all of its state banks began calling in loans. While Barica State Bank suddenly gets into a financial pickle, and I say, who did I loan money to? Bethy. Bethy, I need that money back right now. Bethy's like, hey, we had terms of a loan agreement. Like, yes. And we both agree to give it to me right now. and there's like this panic that people recalling loans quickly. And then Bethy suddenly has to go find money that she doesn't have because all of her cash is tied up in silly bands. And turns around and all of the what's known as the panic, the first real great economic crisis in the country, the Panic of 1819, disrupted all of the political harmony, the era of good feelings, without any real political strife, while there was economic strife. Subpoint E, but there's also political strife. All right. Yes?
What happens to the country's entire economy collapses?
I don't know. Find an example and we'll talk about it. We're going to stay on topic. You have really awesome questions that would make great research papers, but we're not doing them today. Okay. James Monroe, whom we haven't really met yet, but we'll talk about more in a minute. James Monroe, the president, presided over a time where there was no two-party competition, and we call it the era of good feelings. But the absence of political party disputes was replaced with a different kind of fight known as sectionalism. Good vocab word for us today. Sectionalism. Sectionalism is the idea that you begin to think of the country in its sections. New England, Old Northwest, Upper South, Lower South. You begin to think of the country like little territories. And people in New England or the Old Northwest or the Deep South, they just don't have the same interests, much less the same topics or, motivators that other people did. So sectionalism is the idea that the sections of the country end up thinking of themselves autonomously. And we're not fighting over political parties if it gets replaced with fighting over sectionalism. And the central figure in ruining the era of good feelings is, unsurprisingly, Missouri. Okay? Nothing like Missouri to go ruin a good time. When Missouri applied for admission to the Union in 1819, it applied to be entered as a slave state. And, I don't know, Northerners just didn't want to have a slave state admitted to the Union. So New York Congressman James Talmadge said, if we allow Missouri in, then there should be a ban on importing slaves into Missouri. You can't bring any more slaves into Missouri. If you're a slave owner in Missouri, you can have your slaves, but we're going to phase them out. And Missourians said, no, that is not what we did. We applied for admission to the Union as a slave state. So Missourians rejected this. And when they rejected it, a majority, so like the northern part of the House of Representatives, refused to allow Missouri to be entered into the country. To underline their commitment to slavery, in the South, they're like, no, we are a country that has slaves, and you're not going to block it just because you don't like slavery. They said, Maine, aha, Maine, you are also applying to be a state in the North and a free state. And if we don't get our way on Missouri, you're not going to get your way on Maine. And so they refused to allow Maine to enter the country either. The Southerners said, and they back this up not with just like gold-plated racism here. They're making constitutional arguments. They say all of the states have a certain equality to them. There's nothing more special about a northern state or a southern state. All the states are basically equal. And second, that because they have equal, the states can decide what they want to do for themselves. And the people of Missouri, if they want slavery or not, that's an internal matter. And it's not New York's job to go tell Missouri what to do. All the states are equal, and slavery is a state issue, not a federal government issue, and certainly not a New York issue. And thirdly, they say that Congress has no authority to infringe on the property rights of slaveholders. Slaves are property, and Congress is prohibited by its own Constitution from seizing that property or controlling the ownership of stuff. Has no authority to infringe on the property rights of slaveholders. Okay, so we look like we're at a standstill here, not only just with Missouri and Maine, but truly with every future state that's going to be admitted. Like anytime somebody wants to admit a state, they're going to have to fight this fight over and over, and maybe this is just going to be the size of our country from here on out. Until we re-meet, welcome back, Henry Clay, the great compromiser. So Henry Clay proposes a Missouri Compromise. He says, when we admit states, we'll admit them two at a time. One slave and one free. The Southern senators agreed that as part of this deal, we were going to draw a line at the 36th line of latitude, 30 minutes north, and any state admitted above this line is going to be free, and any state admitted below this line is going to be slave. And yes, I know that Missouri is above the line, but we can only tell Missourians so much. So this is going to be the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri debate highlighted that what we're really talking about here was the Western Territory. All of the unorganized territory, like all of the future of this, is going to be a fight over slavery. In literature class, in English class, we call this foreshadowing. Okay? Roman numeral number 12. Between the years of 1810 and 1822, yes, Harry?
Where Kentucky and Virginia above that line?
They sure are. That's very good. They're also already states.
Oh,
Okay.
It goes after that.
Yeah, so between 1810 and 1822, do a little world history here. Spain's colonies, all of the green countries, are colonies of Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, start to get their independence. And for a 12-year period between 1810 and 1822, 17 new countries emerge. By 1830, there basically is no significant Spanish-held properties other than some of the islands in the Caribbean, and basically the great Spanish Empire in the Americas collapses. It collapses one at a time and yet all at once. Okay, in 1822, President James Monroe is watching all of this happen, and he says, man, ooh, Spain's going to be ticked, and I bet they're going to come back for those territories. But James Monroe kind of likes the idea of these being independent countries for a couple of reasons. One, it gets European concerns farther away. But two, there's just something that seems American about it. People fighting for their independence and freeing themselves from the colonies of Europe. And James Monroe needs some way that he thinks to protect these new countries. He's given them, he's extended to them diplomatic recognition. He says, okay, Peru, you used to be part of the viceroyalty of Peru, but now you're your own country, and we're going to recognize you as your own country. Recognition means to acknowledge they're a real thing, right? So the wars of independence, by the way, it's worth noting, were a lot longer and more brutal than our War of Independence, and that right away we turn around with a reasonably successful economy. That didn't happen very well here. Kind of the structures weren't in place. Oops. It's similar and yet different. They're fighting for their independence. It doesn't go as well, and then they have a lot of economic chaos that follows it. Okay. Monroe's Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. He's one of my favorite underrated people in American history. And it's hard to call him underrated because he was President of America. There's only not that many people that have had that job, so he's clearly rated, but I think he's underrated. We'll talk more in a second. So John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, and he proposes to James Monroe a policy whereupon we will draw a mental line in the Atlantic Ocean and say, Europe, North and South America are essentially off limits to you. You can't come and reclaim your colonies. We don't want any more European intrusion into the American hemisphere. You stay on your side of the Atlantic and we'll stay on ours. This becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. Even though it's written by John Quincy Adams, it's promulgated by Monroe, and so we call it the Monroe Doctrine. And basically says, you stay on your side of the ocean, we'll stay on ours. And if you cross into our side of the ocean to go retake some land, then you mess with the bull and you're going to get the horns, and this is how we're going to end up in war. So don't make us go to war. Don't mess with North and South America. Now, the real irony of this is that I don't want to say it's an empty threat, but we are not a world power in 1922. I mean, yeah, we won the War of 1812, but in 1822, we're not like the big kids. We're still growing up, right? If Europe wanted to come pick a war with us, yes, we won the War of 1812, but they could probably still whoop us. But we're going to go ahead in front and say, you stay on your side, we'll stay on ours. We would have lost anything in Europe. So anyway, this is how we get the Monroe Doctrine. Please, good vocab term, second vocab term today, sectionalism, and the nextly the Monroe Doctrine. Remember this. This will be basically American foreign policy until World War I, where we would go get involved in European problems. But this is basically at 1822 becomes for 90 years the way that America approaches the rest of the world. Subpoint B. In 1824, we're up for a presidential election. In the years after James Monroe, we're up for a presidential election. And right away, it's a five-way race. There's 5 people competing for president. And what's the crazy thing is here, this isn't a partisan race. There's only one political party. Everybody's a Republican or a Democrat or a Jeffersonian Republican or a Democratic Republican or a Jeffersonian Democrat. It's all the same party, right? They're all the same party. But there is 2 kind of wings of it. One side that says we want a strong central government, one side that says we want to favor our state government. It's all one political party, but they're still kind of it's not a unified party. And in general, we group them together. The national faction is Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. And then the Jeffersonian side, Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson. We'll talk more about them in a minute. The election of 1824 had 5 candidates, all of whom were Republicans. John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, who is not on this list anywhere, William H. Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. And of those 5 people, the only one who's a name brand is Andrew Jackson. He has national appeal. All the other guys have sectional appeal, right? So John Quincy Adams is a hit in New England. Makes sense. He's from there. Battle of Bunker Hill was fought in his front yard. He knows what's up, right? When you get down into, the Old Northwest, you see kind of this is Clay territory, but Andrew Jackson's the only one that has supporters everywhere. Everybody knows Andrew Jackson. He's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson seems like this quintessential American character. He was an orphan, broke, practically homeless, joined the army, worked his way up the ranks, was kind of an independently wealthy man and a self-made man. He seems like, man, that's such an American story. Love that guy. Anyway, so he set out for the election, and Congress says, our candidate is going to be William Crawford. Okay, Congress doesn't get to pick a president. That's not the way the system works, right? Congress can't be like, hey, we got 5 guys running. Our man is William Crawford. Like, it's not a prime minister, right? So basically, every candidate refuses to accept the selection of Crawford and said we should put this to a vote. John Quincy Adams campaigns on his history as being Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams had some serious chops as a politician. Literally, the revolution was fought in his front yard. At age 12, I don't know how old exactly, he went with his dad to France to go be at the courts of Louis XVI to negotiate loans to the American Revolution. Dude, by the time he was something like 16, is the actual ambassador to the United States to the czarist courts of Russia. He's like a sophomore in high school, and he's representing the whole country in a foreign court to the czars. Secretary of State, had been a U.S. congressman. Dude knew what was up. So, John Quincy Adams campaigning for office, and he's running on that. Andrew Jackson is running as America's man, right? The hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the quintessential American. Henry Clay says, hey, you know all those good times of the American economy? You're welcome. I wrote the American system, the Bank of the United States, the internal improvements, the tariffs, the thing that's making America great. Henry Clay again, right? That's kind of what they're looking at there. And William Crawford is like, yes, but Henry Crawford is running as his adherence to the Jeffersonian ideals. He says, but I'm a man of the people. I'm a man of the Jeffersonian vision of, the power in the hands of the people. And Henry Clay says, I am politically unpopular, so I support Andrew Jackson. Calhoun. Calhoun is not politically viable, so he just throws his support to Andrew Jackson. Yes?
So it's like the Judah and Louisiana, that's episode or something? Is that...
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know.
So if Calhoun stayed in the running, would John Quincy Adams be the president?
I don't know. The good news is that John Quincy Adams did become president because they go and they hold an election and the Electoral College doesn't receive a majority. We've seen this happen before. In 1800, you have the Jefferson and Burr thing and the Electoral College doesn't reach a majority. So where does it go to when there's a tie? Be more specific. The House of Representatives will decide. Henry Clay is a current sitting congressman in the House of Representatives. He's like, yes, home field advantage. But Henry Clay does not have a majority. There's not enough Henry Clayians in the House of Representatives. They're probably going to elect Crawford. They did the last time they talked about this. But Henry Clay says, you know what we could do? I have enough support who will follow me if I turn around and endorse John Quincy Adams. So in the House of Representatives, all the people that would vote for Henry Clay are now joining all of the people who would vote for John Quincy Adams, and JQA can win this thing in 1824, and that's exactly what happens. And JQA says, hey, thanks, Hank. Appreciate that. I'm going to nominate you for Secretary of State. And so Henry Clay becomes nominated for Secretary of State and goes on to be the first and most important appointment of the Adams administration. But this looks fishy to outsiders. And they said, wait a minute. This is a guy using his power and his own authority to get himself put into a pretty sweet cherry job. And that is dirty politics. Here's our third vocab term for the day. The corrupt bargain of the election of 1824, which put John Quincy Adams into office with the power of Henry Clay. In that corrupt bargain, you scratch my back, I'll make you Secretary of State, as the old saying goes. So, John Quincy Adams, our 6th president of the United States. So, John Quincy Adams, I'm not sure there's any person more qualified to be president when taking office than John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams spoke Russian and French and English. He had lived in foreign countries. He had been a House of Representatives. He'd been a diplomat representing other countries, Secretary of State, author of the Monroe Doctrine, and kind of brilliant guy. John Quincy Adams was groomed for this position from a young man. That his dad, John Adams the senior, the elder, basically said, Quincy, here's your career in life. You're going to be a lawyer. You're going to go to Harvard. You're going to be an ambassador. It basically laid out his plot for him. It's not like, didn't mow down the trees for him, but basically gave him his lot, and Quincy really thrived in it and becomes president. John Quincy Adams embraced the American system, protected tariffs, federally subsidized transportation improvements, and the national bank. But his policies tended to favor the business elites of the Northeast and the entrepreneurs and commercial farmers of the Midwest. But the Southerners kind of felt like, John Quincy Adams is not one of our people. He's not one of us. And so and the truth was that he wasn't. John Quincy Adams knew that he was the stuff, and kind of thought he was always the one that was right. And your friend, don't say any names, that always thinks that he's better than you, but he probably is, just a little bit. That's John Quincy Adams. Okay. Congress responds to the public pressure, and Congress approved only a few of Adams's proposals. But the most far-reaching battle of the Adams presidency was over tariffs, and in particular the Adams Tariff of 1824, which protected manufacturers in New England and Pennsylvania against more expensive woolen and cotton textiles and iron goods. But the Tariff of 1824 basically protected New Englanders and Pennsylvania at the expense of Southerners who were selling raw goods to Europe. But as Jimmy pointed out earlier, tariffs bring reciprocal tariffs, and they'd lost their trade markets. The new tariff enraged the South and cost Southern planters $100 million a year. It gets referred to as the Tariff of Abominations. That's a less important but good vocab term. Tariff of 1824, the Tariff of Abominations. And Adams was the last of the elitist politicians and refused to adjust to new styles of party politics.